Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here in person, and thank you to our guests joining us online as well. Welcome to our Axios live event, a global look at energy reliability, independence, and the environment. You know, this morning we're going to be discussing energy crises that are unfolding around the world, often for rather tragic reasons. We're also going to be discussing the transition to cleaner and climate-friendly sources of energy, and also really getting into what I think are the many and very important intersections and connections between those two topics. And I think our first guest is someone who is very well poised to address these issues and topics. He is the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and now a senior advisor at the firm Hogan Lovells. Let's welcome Newell Chatterjee to the stage. Good to see you, Newell. Thanks for being with us. Yeah. So yeah, let's dive right into it. I'd like to start with what is unfolding right now in Europe, and you know, I think there's obviously a real push to have a U.S. role in helping assist European energy security, and certainly the market crises in Europe are also creating ripple effects both on the policy and price front here in the U.S. To what extent do you see the potential for U.S. LNG supplies to assist in European energy security? And is there a tension between ramping up those supplies and domestic prices and reliability and consumer prices here at home?
Yeah, thank you, Axios and Ben, for the opportunity here. That's a great question. I want to start at the onset by noting just what an outright tragedy, a humanitarian tragedy that we're witnessing before our eyes in the Ukraine right now. And in many ways, it is a energy-driven crisis. I think a series of decisions were made in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, that unintentionally empowered Vladimir Putin. I think when you look to Germany in particular, Angela Merkel, who was no Russia dove, who was no Putin fan, made a series of energy policy decisions, whether it be shifting away from coal-fired generation to meet their decarbonization goals, or the post-Fukushima decision to move away from nuclear power. Germany found themselves in a situation where they were totally dependent upon Russian gas. I think Western Europe writ large was viewing natural gas as a bridge to a clean energy future, and Vladimir Putin blew up the bridge. And that is now wreaking havoc, not just in Europe, but around the world. I think one of the undertold stories of this crisis isn't just the strain on Europe. Europe is in a position they can afford to pay exorbitantly high prices for natural gas for the time being. But that's leading to such tight supplies that it's really harming poorer countries around the world that are also dependent on the gas. And that does create not just an opportunity, but I think an expectation on the part of our allies that America can play a critical role here, and that U.S. LNG exports can not only play that positive benefit of geopolitically giving our allies an alternative to Russian gas, but environmentally, look, you know, Russia's methane emissions, the manner in which they extract gas is far dirtier than we do it here in the U.S. And I think cleaner U.S. LNG displacing dirty Russian gas not only gives that geopolitical benefit, but an environmental one as well.
To what extent do you see that those arguments and that position having an effect at this point on U.S. policy? I mean, I know hypotheticals are always a little bit dicey, but if you look at the Biden administration posture toward LNG and the FERC posture toward LNG right now, would those have been different absent the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine?
Look, I think, you know, as policies have evolved in the U.S. and during my tenure at FERC, there's no question that our process for evaluating applications for natural gas and liquefied natural gas export facilities were challenged in the courts. And, you know, it's responsible for an agency like FERC to continually revisit the legal durability of the orders that the commission puts out. But I think there's no question that the war in Ukraine has reawoken our need for focusing on energy security and reliability, which is, I know, the theme of this event this morning. I think there's increased recognition that we need to factor in energy security in our domestic policy. And I think that in many ways, seeing this example in Europe has caused us to revisit how we've, in our focus on decarbonization, have we somewhat taken our eyes off of reliability and energy security. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't think reliability should be weaponized or used as an excuse to slow down the energy transition. I think that as we undergo the energy transition, we just need to factor in reliability and energy security in a responsible way.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think discussions of reliability, but in particular with the focus on Europe right now, I think discussions of LNG policy are on some level unavoidably questions about climate change policy. I mean, certainly I get that when gas is combusted, it has fewer emissions than coal. But that said, there is the topic of leaks of the very potent greenhouse gas methane further up the development chain. There's still a significant amount of carbon emissions when you do burn natural gas. One thing that I think is a concern is that if there is going to be an expansion of LNG infrastructure, that this is on some level going to be locking in a long-term use of the fuel for a window that's actually well in excess of what would enable the world to hit its climate change goals. Do you see an ability to reconcile that tension?
I do. I think that's a rational conversation that can be had. And I understand the concern that there is this need for the gas in the short term, but we want to accelerate the energy transition, and we don't want to find ourselves in a position where assets are being run well past their useful life because we made decisions in the short term. And to me, that's a conversation you can have. Those are parameters you can work around and negotiate. And I think European governments, for instance, can provide supports to incentivize American exporters to enter into longer-term agreements, with an understanding that as Europe transitions towards cleaner sources of energy, as demand for the gas hopefully, begins to reduce over time, that we can find ourselves in a position that, we can responsibly negotiate a path forward. My concern is actually that the hesitation on the part of entering into long-term contracts from the European side as well as the US side isn't actually about trapped emissions. It's this expectation that the status quo of returning to cheap Russian natural gas will return. That's my greater concern, is that if we, because we're being cautious about trapping emissions, are too slow in our processes here, if that just further empowers Putin. And I do get the sense when I have conversations with my former colleagues who are European regulators, they are under tremendous pressure because it is politically difficult to ask your citizenry to continually absorb these really, really high costs. And I understand the temptation of wanting to return to inexpensive Russian natural gas. So again, I think this is a constructive discussion we can have going forward. We are seeing some progress. There was an announcement last week. U.S. LNG exporter Venture Global entered into a long-term agreement, the first long-term agreement since the war in Ukraine. And so I think that's a sign, in my view, of positive momentum in this direction.
I wanted to turn back to our domestic policy and grids here and turn to the question of reliability. I mean, certainly as different types of extreme weather worsen, we've already been seeing a lot of stresses on power systems in states that have actually very different types of networks but suffer some of the sort of same threats and pressures. We've seen this in California, we've seen this in Texas. To what extent do you see the US moving toward a more reliable grid, and is that movement keeping pace with the increasing levels of stresses on the grid?
Yeah, it's a really challenging conundrum. What we are seeing, and you cited two examples, we've got California, a progressive state, Texas, a conservative one. Both of their grids were pushed to the brink by extreme weather events. extreme heat and wildfires in California, extreme cold weather event in Texas. And in my view, what that goes to show is that climate change doesn't care if you're a conservative state or a liberal state. And we all have to contend with the fact that our grids are going to be continually tested by these weather events. The challenge is the policies that we need to undertake to mitigate carbon emissions and combat climate change may actually make us more vulnerable to these weather-dependent events as we are deploying more weather-dependent resources. And that's where this tricky balance comes in. How do we account for a need to mitigate emissions while preserving reliability in the face of extreme weather? It's an extremely complicated problem, but it's one that I'm confident policymakers can tackle. And in my view, it all starts with transmission.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the big debates that we're seeing right now on Capitol Hill in the wake of the passage of the large climate and clean energy investment law, we're now seeing an effort to effectively mandate and accelerate permitting processes for many different types of energy sources, natural gas pipelines, renewables, critical minerals, but also transmission. To what extent is the envisioned build-out of more renewables in the, quote, Inflation Reduction Act tethered to the ability to build a lot more transmission? You know, I sometimes hear people saying, okay, this permitting legislation is either flawed or perhaps on the flip side, a good to have but not a must have, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where I hear other sources say, we cannot breathe life into this new legislation absent this subsequent permitting reform. Which of these two poles, if either one, is accurate?
Yeah, I think permitting reform is an absolute must-have. I think the current iteration could certainly use some improvement, but I think it's critical for this reason alone. So the Inflation Reduction Act made a substantial investment in a whole host of energy technologies. Long-term certainty for wind and solar, but also new investments in energy storage, in nuclear, in carbon capture. I thought the smartest thing the legislation did was invest in bringing the domestic supply chain home for our clean energy future. But all of it is for naught if we can't get transmission right. I have seen some analyses that almost 80% of the envisioned carbon emission reductions projected to be derived from the IRA won't materialize if we don't dramatically accelerate the pace at which we build transmission in this country. The problem is it's very, very hard to build infrastructure in the United States, and that's why I think this permitting reform is so critical. I was screaming this from the rooftops during my waning days at FERC, that you cannot, on the one hand, tie up the build out of natural gas pipelines on the NGA side and not expect those same obstacles to emerge when you try and build transmission on the FPA side. And I think what we're finding now is historically the opponents of building out energy infrastructure, because it was largely fossil fuel infrastructure, are now the proponents of building out transmission to bring clean energy onto the grid. And so I think it's going to take a rethinking of how we look at permitting in this country. I think to the extent that there were concerns about making it easier to build a natural gas pipeline in the short term, we need to make it more responsible without cutting corners, without sacrificing environmental quality or safety to build natural gas pipelines in this country. And if the benefit is long-term, you simultaneously make it easier to build transmission. I think it's a win-win. And so I hope Congress can come back and revisit this, make some changes to maybe make meaningful reforms on the gas side and address some of the legitimate challenges that exist to building transmission.
You know, clearly passing substantive legislation of almost any sort in this day and age is an enormous challenge. We saw the permitting legislation be stripped from the government funding bill because the votes simply weren't there. If you had to look into your crystal ball, to what extent do you see this perhaps occurring in the lame duck session? Do you see the votes being there at this point?
I'm always reluctant to project on what may or may not occur and predict, like not knowing the results of the election and what the parameters of a lame duck might look like. Rather than speculate on that, I'm more focused on what my former colleagues at FERC are undertaking in the transmission space. Under Chairman Glick's leadership, they have undergone a process to really take a holistic look at how we build transmission in this country. They're evaluating everything from siting to cost allocation to planning to competition. I do hope that they will revisit the value of competition in the transmission space. But I'm very encouraged by that effort. And I know I've got at least one former state regulatory colleague in the crowd today. What I really appreciate about FERC's effort is they're working hand in glove with the states to try and tackle what is very much a complex challenge.
Definitely. Thank you. As our time winds down, I guess one thing I wanted to ask is, what is the one thing that is flying under the radar right now? What is one thing that we should expect to hear a lot more about in the months and years ahead that perhaps not enough people are talking about, or that there is just generally not an awareness of?
I'm biased here, but I'm very proud of a couple of initiatives FERC took during my tenure to remove barriers to entry to energy storage and to aggregated distributed energy resources. FERC is going through the compliance process now on FERC Order 2222 to remove these barriers and enable DERs to be compensated for all of their attributes. And I think that's really, really exciting and has the capacity to potentially fundamentally alter the way that Americans generate, distribute, and consume power. And so I think that is a under the radar story that, you know, we may wake up 5, 7, 10 years from now and say, wow, what a remarkable transformation that occurred because of this wonky FERC rule.
Very interesting. We'll have to keep our eye on that. I think we are unfortunately out of time. Newell, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator and founder of Storyline, Chris Freitz.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to our sponsor, the Partnership to Address Global Emissions and EQT, for making our event possible. I'm excited to host our View from the Top segment this morning, and I want to welcome to the stage right now the President and CEO of EQT, Toby Rice. Toby. Thank you, sir. So, Toby, I want to start with what everybody's talking about, and that's the European energy crisis. And when you take a look at how quickly that energy has become unreliable and insecure, it really raises the question, how do we stabilize the world's energy supply while still reducing global greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, the world is in an energy crisis right now, and I think the events that are playing out in Europe can show how bad things can get if we don't have access to cheap, reliable, clean energy. And unfortunately, this crisis is not just being borne by Europe. We're seeing that here in the United States as well. Oil prices being too high, price of gasoline at the pump, straining American families. And now you start seeing electricity prices around the country are starting to go up. So clearly, we're dealing with an energy crisis here in the United States as well. This is incredibly important that we figure this out because we understand that energy consumption is what drives human progress. It's what makes modern societies possible. And the reason why we're in this crisis is really simple to understand. We are in an energy undersupply. So if you want to fix this, let's get more supply into the market. And we specifically need to focus on natural gas because natural gas is the key pillar to 4 foundational elements of modern society: steel, cement, plastics, and fertilizer. So we really need to focus on natural gas because that's a really critical element to modern society. And the good news is we've got an amazing solution to add more supply. And the supply that we need to be adding needs to be the cheapest, most reliable, cleanest form of energy. And we've got a really great solution to help end this energy crisis.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on that a little bit because I think we have seen solutions on the supply side, but also on the emissions side. If you take a look over the last 15 years, we've seen significant progress in the United States in reducing our overall emissions. But meanwhile, globally, we're seeing carbon dioxide emissions continuing to rise, hitting the highest levels ever last year. So I wonder what's working here and how can we export that success to other countries?
So we have had tremendous success in the United States in lowering emissions and providing reliable energy to our country. But the unfortunate situation is, despite the U.S. leadership, we've lowered emissions over 1 billion tons over the last 15 years. Global emissions are still rising, and we've seen emissions rise over 7 billion tons. So while we need to keep doing the great work that we've been doing here in the United States to lower emissions within our borders, we also need to ask the question, what can the United States do to lower emissions outside of our borders? And we can actually take a proven playbook that we've done here in the United States, and the biggest reason why we've been able to lower emissions comes from one thing, and that's replacing coal with natural gas. That's over 60% of the emissions reductions in the United States came from doing that one thing. So to lower emissions outside of our borders, you ask a question, can we do the same thing we've done here in the United States, but do it on a global stage? The answer is yes. We have a tremendous supply of natural gas. We can move that to the shores, liquefy it in the form of LNG, and send that around the world to lower emissions. Every beast to replace foreign coal, which, by the way, is the biggest source of emissions on the planet. So if you want to lower global emissions, focus on the biggest source, foreign coal. The dynamics behind that, the emissions reduction potential of LNG is tremendous. Every BCF a day we could put on the water will lower emissions by over 30 million tons. It's equivalent to electrifying over 6 million vehicles, incredibly impactful. We have the potential here in the United States to increase our natural gas production by an incremental 50 BCF a day for LNG exports. We have the potential to quadruple our LNG exports. And if we can do that, it will have the environmental impact equivalent to electrifying every vehicle in the country, putting solar panels on every house in America, and also doubling U.S. wind capacity. That's 54,000 industrial scale wind turbines combined. It's absolutely massive. There's nothing bigger. That's why we call Unleash U.S. LNG the biggest green initiative on the planet. But think about the world that we'll be in if we can be successful in unleashing U.S. LNG on the world stage. We will address the world's energy crisis and the energy undersupply that's causing tremendous pain and suffering for a lot of people around the world. From an energy security perspective, unleashing this amount of energy is going to bring an unprecedented amount of energy security to Americans. Exports means surplus, and surplus means lower prices. This amount of energy would be the key for us to responding to price signals. We'll have a tremendous ability to respond to high prices. Right now, when I see a price signal, by the time I push the button on my desk to add rigs, it takes about 18 months to get the permits, the rigs, get the wells drilled, to get them hooked up to sales, and get that supply to help address prices. That's not very responsive. In an Unleash U.S. LNG scenario, we'll be able to have that gas flowing above pipelines, in pipelines, on standby, ready for when Americans need it, and we can respond to high prices in 18 hours. America wants a spigot. This is the spigot. The energy security it's going to provide for our allies is absolutely tremendous. This amount of energy on the world stage will replace Russian influence 2.5 times over. And to quantify the amount of influence and stability that this will bring to the world, 60 BCF a day is what we think we can export here in the United States. That is the energy equivalent that will have a political influence equivalent to over 10 million barrels a day of oil, but it's clean energy. And that will certainly bring a stabilizing force to the world stage.
So a lot of solutions there, but I wonder when you look at the challenges, what is the biggest challenge to cleaner and more reliable global energy supply?
The biggest thing that's prevented us from adding more supply to meet the growing demand for world energy, it's real simple. It's pipeline infrastructure. That is the one thing that we need, and with infrastructure, we can begin to start adding the supply and meet world demand. I think the key to getting this infrastructure, though, is we need to start raising awareness. We need to let people know that we have a real solution. The most impactful thing that we can do can start here in the United States, and we can end this energy crisis. So we've been out talking about Unleash US LNG and how this can be the biggest green initiative on the planet. It's the key to energy security and low prices for Americans and our allies around the world. Oh, and by the way, it's the biggest jobs creator in the country. So getting support for this idea, you can understand why people have been so excited about this, because whether you care about the environment, whether you care about energy security and low prices, or whether you care about jobs in the economy, you should care about unleashing US LNG. That support isn't just contained within the conversations we're having with our leaders. You look at Americans, and over 70% of Americans support more natural gas development. Over 70% of Americans support more pipeline infrastructure. So I think now we've quantified the potential. It's massive, and it's the most exciting opportunity in energy in the United States, for the world, and for Americans. And now it's just about putting the pieces together so we can get this infrastructure built and work to end this energy crisis.
And I wonder, when you look ahead, what are the most exciting emerging technologies that you see? Like, where are we going to see the biggest progress?
Well, just starting with proven solutions that we have right now. I mean, sometimes to solve big problems, a lot of people think about innovating, and this is a situation where I believe we need to be applying proven solutions, and that's replacing coal with natural gas. That will be a huge, huge opportunity. And think about what this world will be here in the United States as we transition the world from coal to natural gas.
Right.
That is going to create a tremendous amount of clean energy here in the United States. And we can now begin and be a role model for the world to transition from from natural gas here in the US to zero carbon solutions.
Right.
And what's really exciting about natural gas is natural gas can be transformed into a zero carbon solution. Whether that's through pulling off the carbon and creating blue hydrogen, that's a zero carbon solution, or post-combustion with the utilization of carbon capture. Things that we know we can do right now, and unleashing US LNG is going to unleash our potential to bring a zero carbon economy here in America.
So we have just a minute left, but I want to leave on this note, because I'm curious, why did you launch PAGE, the partnership to address global emissions, and what role is that coalition going to play in shaping our climate future?
So PAGE was supported to bring interested stakeholders, thought leaders together under one coalition to help make this great idea a reality. So with this coalition, some of the things that we're going to be doing is one, spreading awareness, but two, also looking at the things that we need to do to fast track our ability to unleash American energy, unleash US LNG, decarbonize the world, give the world an option to get off of coal. And right now there's a ton of work to do to be able to make this happen. The good news is we can get this infrastructure built in less than 24 months. Now that's if we had all the permits and regulations in hand.
Right.
Now the reality is it's going to take us multiples of that to get these solutions put in play. The question we need to ask is, what can we do to create a situation where we can go from, instead of 8 years, we can get it closer to 2.
Okay.
Every year matters, because every year that we can continue to limp along in this energy undersupply, every winter that Europe needs to go without having the energy security, they're putting themselves in a very precarious predicament, praying for a mild winter. And we are a modern society. We should not be praying to the weather gods for the safety and security and well-being of our people. Absolutely.
We have to leave it there. We will look forward to what PAGE does here in the future. Toby Rice is the president and CEO of EGT. Thank you, brother. I appreciate the conversation.
And next, it's me, host of Axios Today, Nyla Boodoo. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Our next guest is the president and CEO of the nonprofit Resources for the Future. He was also formerly in charge of the Energy Information Administration. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Richard Newell. Thanks for being here with us this morning. You know, as we're talking about this, you and I were talking backstage about sort of the two crises we're facing, and I want to get to the climate change part of this, but let's just start with energy security. And I'm curious your perspective on how you think about and approach that in your work.
Yeah, energy security concerns, which I think had abated, not just in the United States, but globally for a couple decades, really have reemerged as a key concern with the war in Ukraine. And so I think it is important to think about, like, what does energy security mean? Because it's a term that's bandied about often loosely. And so, you know, I think it's important to think about energy security ultimately as a risk management problem. Having a secure energy system is an energy system that is resilient in the face of disruptive events. It's an energy system that can recover quickly or withstand difficult conditions. And it's also an energy system that isn't overly subject to influencing your foreign policy due to the conditions of the energy market. So that helps you understand that energy security is ultimately a risk management problem, and that also helps you to start understand its relationship to climate, not only through the energy system itself, but climate itself being a risk management problem.
And so do you worry that because there's it's almost like there's so much of the headlines and the breaking news right now, and the prices people are paying at the pump, what's dominating the political conversation is energy security. Do you worry about how to incorporate climate change into that?
Well, you know, there's the near term and there's the long term. And one of the challenges with the energy crisis and the climate crisis, these dual crises that we're now facing, is the energy crisis is immediate. It's now. It's very short term. The climate crisis is something that is impacting us now. Climate change is already affecting us, but it's something that will play out over the course of decades, even centuries. And so how do we keep our eye on that long-term problem? Because the emissions we have today accumulate and will persist for decades and centuries. And so really what we need to do is identify, to the extent we can, solutions to the current energy crisis that also advance the ball on carbon mitigation, on the climate crisis, not set us back. Because really, the long-term energy system is nothing more than the accumulation of short-term decisions. And what we don't want to find is ourselves, 10 years from now in the situation that we're in now, where we face another energy crisis that we haven't planned for the future. So I think that that's the most important way to, connect these two things. So when you think about, like, how do we advance the ball on both of these fronts, when I think about security, energy security, and also climate security, it's really about really three ways to do that. One is by reducing your exposure to the risk. So if we think about risk management, reduce your exposure to the risk. So that's doing things like demand reduction, energy efficiency, simply reducing our contribution to climate and reducing our exposure to energy price shocks. Second is diversifying, right? So diversifying your supply options, diversifying the technologies that we use to support the energy system and energy transition. And finally, buying some insurance, right? And what's the form of insurance that we have? Well, there's strategic petroleum reserves that we can use in the event of a disruptive events. There's having reliability in our electrical system, having a reserve margin so that we can respond to difficult conditions. So if we apply these kind of basic risk management principles and then choose options that help both on the energy front and energy security as well as climate security, that's the direction that we should try to head.
And so when you look at pieces of legislation like the IRA, do you feel like that fulfilled both of those objectives of risk management as well as everything you've been talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which is by far the biggest, most impactful bill passed in the United States for climate, period. I mean, it's $370 billion of direct federal incentives, but that doesn't include all of the private sector capital that's going to move, because that's in the form of tax credits, which then are going to move capital. So really, really important for the decarbonization in particular of the power sector, which is kind of a linchpin of a broader economy decarbonization, because if we want to electrify vehicles and we want that to be low carbon, we need to decarbonize the grid. So really, really important step. Also very important in terms of U.S. standing internationally. Without the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States would go into the climate conference in Egypt in a few weeks, really at a pretty poor position in terms of our ability to meet our national commitments. And the Inflation Reduction Act changes that in a big way. The other thing that it does, though, it does pay attention to
emerging security concerns, right? So we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act attention to critical minerals, which is emerging as a very important issue. It's always kind of been there, but with the criticality of things like cobalt and copper and nickel to the clean energy transition, how those supply chains are sourced is a really important concern, and so it pays attention to that. It also pays increasing attention to, I would say, kind of local economic development concerns through things like domestic content standards. And so we're seeing climate legislation that's maybe different than many of us had anticipated, particularly if you look back 10 years. It's climate-related legislation that's also addressing other key national concerns, both in terms of energy security and also economic well-being. Final point here, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act for a reason. It's because we're currently in a very inflationary environment, and that's evident in the types of policies that were put forward in the act because they're largely carrots and not sticks. They're really government support for supply of clean power, which actually can bring electricity prices down, not raise them. And so there's a number of different things that are being manifested in that are not just about climate change.
So I wanted to shift a little bit. As you mentioned inflation, I was just thinking about the idea of the social cost of carbon and its effect on people. My colleague Andrew Friedman, who's going to be out here in just a minute, and I were talking about this last week, and he called it the most important number people don't know about. Yeah. Can you just sort of explain for us a little bit about when we're thinking about the social cost of carbon, and I'm talking about whether we're talking about flood damage or health insurance premiums that people are paying or lost crops, like how should we be thinking about that fitting into this conversation?
Well, the social cost of carbon represents the damages caused by emitting a ton of greenhouse gas, a ton of carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere. So this is not a cost that we would normally directly face, right? So when we go to buy, gasoline at the pump or pay our electricity bill, we're paying the direct cost, based on the fuels and the equipment that's required to produce that. What we're not paying is the cost to the climate, to society, from the damages imposed by that over the next years, decades, centuries. And so what the social cost of carbon does is it quantifies those damages in economic terms, in dollars and cents, so that they can be paired kind of on a level playing field alongside the costs of taking actions to reduce emissions. And so it includes things like damage to agricultural crops due to changing temperature and precipitation. It includes sea level rise and coastal inundation and flooding, damages from that. It includes changes in the cost of running our energy system, right? So if you have a warmer climate, that means it's going to cost more to cool our buildings in the summertime. It'll also cost less to warm our buildings in the wintertime, and so that's also included. And it also includes, very importantly, human health stress. So heat stress is a very important, really important consequence of climate change, and we've definitely seen that over the last few years, Europe, the United States, and so on. So what the social cost of carbon, it aggregates all of these and puts them in dollar terms so that they can be incorporated into policy decisions and other decisions.
And you've been writing recently about how inaccurate it is, the number that we're using as a valuation right now. Why do you think our valuation is off?
Yes, so there's been a very, very deliberate and detailed multi-year process to update the scientific basis for the social cost of carbon and other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrogen oxides. So in 2017, the National Academy of Sciences put out a major report that put forward a number of different recommendations for how the science needed to be improved in order to better underpin these social cost of carbon estimates. We at Resources for the Future led an initiative over the last several years bringing together the scientific and research community to respond to these recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences. And the reason that we didn't do this alone, we really there's 10 major institutions involved, many more researchers than that. And the reason we have this collection of experts is because when you're addressing things like climate change, it's not just economic expertise. It's expertise on demography. What does the future of the world population look like? It's, of course, expertise on climate science, the atmospheric science of climate change. It's also not just economists who work on environment. It's macroeconomists who can project forward on global income growth. So we've had a multi-year effort to update all of that scientific basis. We just had a paper that was released in the journal Nature a few weeks ago. And what we found was that when you improve all of these different steps in the estimation process, the social cost of carbon that results is more than 3 times higher than the estimate that's currently being used by the federal government. So it's $185 per ton is the preferred value that we focus on, and that's in comparison to the current interim estimates that are being used by the federal government of $51 per ton.
And so what are the challenges to getting that across? Because 3 times is, as an economist, I would say you'd probably say that's pretty significant, right?
That's a very, yeah. I would say, and if I had to think back in 2017 when we launched this effort, would I have guessed that it would have been that significant? I would have said probably not. It's a major change, and that's really a function of a number of different changes in the methodology, but that's the result that emerged.
And so what do you think the challenges are to getting that across to a general audience, to an energy audience, to Washington?
Well, what this means is that when the government, so the most immediate use of these kinds of numbers is the federal government when it's doing regulatory analysis. So when the government is putting forward regulations for reducing emissions from power plants or appliance efficiency standards for home appliances like washers and dryers, when automobile fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe standards for automobiles are being set, a very important ingredient that is, not only, what are the costs of that regulation in terms of increased, product costs, but what's the value of that? What are the benefits of that policy action? And it's really, the social cost of carbon really measures the benefits of taking that action. So what this means is that if this is incorporated by the federal government, the number I mentioned earlier is estimates that we've put forward. It's not yet the official government estimates. It would mean that the benefits attached to these kinds of actions would be over 3 times higher. And so, for example, the Clean Power Plan during the Obama administration, power plant regulations had about equal effect in terms of their direct air quality benefits, things like local smog and other local pollutants, and their climate benefits. It was about equal. If in future policies and regulatory actions, there'd be much greater weight placed on the climate part of that. So I think what it means, practically speaking, is that the benefits of these kinds of actions will be significantly higher, and that could motivate more stringent climate actions.
And I think as we look to the future, as you all anticipate possibly a potential change in leadership in Washington after the midterm elections, how do you frame that conversation differently if Democrats aren't in power?
Well, it's one of the reasons why it's so important for there to be a strong scientific basis for these very key ingredients into policy processes, is that they're not subject to political wins. They really shouldn't be. And that's why there's been such care taken to peer review all of the process that went into this, to do it in a very transparent fashion. I could go into lots of details, but in addition to updating the scientific basis, we've created an open source computing platform. It's available for anybody to inspect. It's also available to the scientific community to take and improve over time. So I think it's really, really important to ground these decisions in science, which really shouldn't be subject to political wins.
Richard, we're almost out of time, but I feel like we've talked about a lot here. We've gone from energy security to the social cost of carbon. I think particularly for people who work on climate change, one of the things I actually hear most often from my listeners to my podcast is how hopeless everything seems to people who are maybe not engaged in this on a daily basis. And I just wanted to end by asking what gives you hope about the work that you do?
Well, I think that there's been tremendous progress made, I think, on the technological front. The cost of renewable energy has come down dramatically, really just over the last decade. We've also, not only with renewables, we've also got much better options in other areas. We've got things like direct air capture, which can remove carbon dioxide emissions directly from the atmosphere. We have carbon capture and storage, which can scrub the flue gases that come if you do combust fossil fuels. We've got advanced nuclear technologies that are being developed. So there's a lot of different technologies. Our technological options for addressing climate change have improved dramatically and are continuing to improve. I think also the orientation toward that, at least in the United States, I think one of the really good things in the Inflation Reduction Act is it's quite technology inclusive. So the openness of different stakeholders to a wide variety of options, I think, is headed in a good direction, because energy pervades our entire economic system. We don't have silver bullets. We need to be growing forests. We need to be removing carbon dioxide. We need to be switching to renewable energy. We need to be scrubbing the flue gas that we have. And having that inclusive orientation, I think, is very important. It's not only important technically, it's also important politically, because different regions of the country, different regions of the world have different local capacities. They have different indigenous resources. And if we can create solutions that kind of have opportunities for stakeholders to engage and communities to engage, I think that's a good thing. And so we need to keep our aperture open and continue to open that. And I think that that's headed in a positive direction.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, Richard, but thank you so much for your conversation today.
It's my pleasure.
And now please welcome Axios climate and energy reporter, Andrew Friedman.
Thanks for coming in person this morning. Our next guest has had a long type of career that makes me question my own career choices. Because he served on Capitol Hill, Energy Department, White House National Security Council, International Energy Agency, and now currently, please welcome Deputy Secretary of Energy, David Turk. Thank you, Andrew. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Well, thanks for that very kind introduction, Andrew. I think that's the nicest introduction I've maybe ever gotten.
I was looking at your bio and I was like, what have I am not as accomplished as I really should be.
Well, I've been very lucky. I've had some great opportunities.
Nice. So first, I got to start off with gas prices, which are top of mind for many Americans right now in the wake of the OPEC Plus decision. I'm curious what you're expecting to see in terms of actual gas price responses in the United States over the next couple of weeks. Like, how significant do you think the consequences might be that ordinary people would see?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And gas prices, the price at the pump is not only top of mind for Americans across the country and frankly, people across the world. I can personally say it's top of mind to President Biden, to Secretary Granholm, to Brian Deese, to Ron Klain, it's to the full team, right? This is one thing the president, to all of us on a regular basis, a daily basis, sometimes an hourly basis, affordability, right? Like that's what we've got to keep our eye on the ball. We've got to use all the tools in our tool belt to keep the affordability on gas prices, other energy prices, but more broadly than that. So we have seen significant cost reductions at the pump over the last several months. That is a very good news story, and a lot of efforts have gone into that, including what we did with our Strategic Petroleum Reserve and other kinds of efforts from this administration side. But we have seen the prices at the pump, unfortunately, tick up in recent weeks, and of course with the OPEC Plus decision, which was disappointing from this administration's perspective. I think disappointing to consumers, not just here in the US, but one thing I think that's lost, we were just talking backstage, I was in Africa last week, it's low and middle income countries that are bearing the brunt. All of us are bearing the brunt of this misguided decision by OPEC Plus, but it's those countries who are least able to withstand these kinds of price increases. So we're going to do everything we can with the tools we have to try to keep that downward pressure overall on crude oil and make sure we're doing everything else to try to have as much affordability as we possibly can. But these are dynamic times. There's no doubt these are dynamic times in the oil markets.
Yeah. It seems to me we've pulled a lot of the price levers that we have. So releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, other steps. The administration is considering taking more action. A refined products ban is still on the table. Are you willing to go through with that? And are you worried about unintended consequences with such a step?
So the president has made it clear in advancing affordability and the prime directive on that, that we have to have all tools on the table. And what we do at the Department of Energy is do analysis on what are the pros and cons of this tool or that tool in this particular market environment or that particular market environment. I feel quite good with what we've done with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think that has had a downward pressure on the market and at least partially responsible for the significant decreases we've seen over the last several months. We still have some additional ability to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the coming weeks and months as needed. We just announced 10 million additional barrels in November. That should then have a downward pressure on the market. There's certainly a lot outside of our immediate control. One of the things that determines global oil price is what big economies are doing and how well they're doing around the world. While the US economy has been doing well, China's economy has not been doing well, and that has actually had some downward pressure on the price of oil. That, of course, is largely outside of our control in terms of where their economy is going forward along those lines. So we've had extensive conversations, including over this weekend, on what are the right tools to deploy, when would we deploy them, what are the pros, what are the cons. And we're also going to continue very, very extensive conversations with our domestic producers, in particular, Secretary Granholm, the President, others of us, myself, have had ongoing conversations, and that's a very important set of conversations to have.
And lastly, on the gas price string of questions, do you think NOPEC legislation, which has been kicked around for a long time, now has some sort of momentum behind it in Congress, would actually, despite its potential downsides, would be potentially effective in lowering prices or pressuring OPEC plus?
So we are definitely having conversations, as one would expect, with members of Congress on what particular additional tools we might want to have in the tool belt to deal with these issues. The White House was clear after the OPEC plus decision that we'll have some of those additional conversations to see what makes sense in that context. And again, what we're doing internally is weighing the pros and the cons of this approach, that approach, and can't say anything more at this point beyond that.
Figured you'd say that.
I don't want to get myself into trouble, if that's okay.
Right now, much of the conversation on energy reliability is obviously focused on getting Europe through the winter. They're going through what might be termed a forced rapid energy transition. Well, we're at the start of our own planned acceleration in the journey with the passage of the IRA and other legislation. How do you think about balancing the need to deploy more clean energy as fast as possible and the need to maintain energy reliability on the grid?
So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. In fact, I think the quicker we deploy a diverse range of clean energy technologies, renewable storage, hydrogen, you name it, geothermal, the better off we're going to be not only from a climate perspective, that's what, as you know very well, Andrew, from all your reporting, that's what the scientists are telling us we need to do from a CO2 reduction side of things. But I actually think it also improves energy security and improves energy affordability as well. On the affordability side, I think what we've seen over the last couple years is another reminder of what happens when you're overly reliant on a single commodity or a couple commodities that you don't have control over. Even a major oil-producing, natural gas-producing country like ourselves, it's a global oil market. So even if we're producing more oil than we use and it's a global oil market, we're beholden to whatever the global price is, just like other countries around the world. That is not a comfortable place to be in from an affordability and a predictability of your own prices domestically, and causing all the pain and turmoil and lack of planning and heartache, most importantly, as President Biden has stressed over and over again, to real people out there in the real world. So I think when you build more solar, when you build more offshore wind, onshore wind, geothermal, nuclear, you name it, in a diverse way, in a way that has grids and transmission, right? We've got to figure out how to make all of this work in a system-wide perspective, and we're doing an awful lot of work on that. I think that is better security, I think it's better affordability, and especially the predictability of the affordability piece, which I think people are coming to really appreciate more and more. So I think Europe is doubling down, and they're going big on the energy transition. They've been doing that for a while. They're going to do that even more so in the midst of this current challenge that they face. I think that's a good thing, and they will be much better off from a security and affordability perspective. So I think the accelerated build out of all these clean energy technologies, to me, is a no regrets plan that is helpful on all fronts. We just need to move as quick as we can and at a scale and pace that we've never moved before. And I think we're doing that. It's incredibly exciting with the latest legislation that's passed Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act, but before that, bipartisan infrastructure legislation. We have never been in position in the United States to execute with certainty in the market. And it's incredibly, incredibly exciting to see the whole slate of announcements from car companies and battery manufacturers. I think the numbers are going to be even higher than what we're predicting the numbers are going to be in terms of deployment.
To that end, what technologies are top of mind for you that we need to advance in order to ensure the transition is rapid but not too turbulent?
Yeah, so it's a little bit like telling your kid which of your kids is favorite, but I'll give a little bit of favorites. Sometimes I do that with my kids, and they don't appreciate it so much with our 3 kids. So a few that I think are particularly exciting. Offshore wind, I've thought for a while, is a very exciting technology. We're now finally starting to really build it out on the East Coast. We've now launched an Earthshot, what we're calling an Earthshot on floating offshore wind that'll help the West Coast to bring those costs down. The higher capacity factors that you have with offshore wind, the fact that an analysis that I was a part of back when I worked with the International Energy Agency found that if you look around the world, at even just the best offshore wind resource potential, there's 18 times the amount just in offshore wind potential out there than we currently use in electricity around the world. So there's a huge amount of higher capacity factors, offshore wind kind of piece. So I think that's an incredibly important technology. Storage, I think we need to drive down the costs, especially for the longer duration energy storage, and we've launched an Earthshot on that to drive those costs down. Incredibly important part. And then the grids. The grids, for those who know the energy sector, know how important the grids are in transmission, and we've got to really do everything we can to make sure we've got the transmission, the grids, the smart grid component to it, and that's incredibly, incredibly important. There's heat pumps, there's geothermal, there's any number of other really small modular reactors on the nuclear side. There's a number of really exciting technologies. It's the best part of this job.
You've been involved in helping other countries plan their clean energy transitions. A major step in the run-up or associated with COP26 was the Just Energy Partnership with South Africa. Should we be expecting a similar announcement with other countries soon ahead of COP27 or associated with COP27, perhaps in Southeast Asia?
So I was just in South Africa last week and then in Ghana as well, just trying to get a feel for how the US and the Department of Energy in particular can be a good partner for these countries as they engage in their real world transitions, not only focused on climate, but focused on affordability, focused on doing it the right way in terms of environmental justice. I think the JET-P model, for those who are familiar with it, is a really interesting model and concept. The idea is you get a bunch of donors together, you work with South Africa, and now it's being talked about with Indonesia, being talked about with several other countries, in a way that those countries decide for themselves what their transition paths are, but countries that are able to be donor countries and bring the likes of our Development Finance Corporation, other tools that we can from the US, work in partnership with those countries and all accelerate it in their interests, but in the global interests of reducing CO2 emissions and methane emissions. So I think it's an incredibly powerful concept, and that in tandem with a number of other mechanisms, tools that can be brought to the table, I think is a really important part of the architecture for us to be successful. One thing we're trying to do from the Department of Energy side is we've got phenomenal national lab expertise, 17 labs across the country, phenomenal expertise who've been working on solar and wind and storage and all these technologies for years and years. We're trying to leverage that expertise to help the likes of South Africa or Ghana, where I was as well, or Indonesia, where I was a few weeks ago, or any number of countries around the world, so that they can benefit from that world-class expertise and have comfort to accelerate their transitions even quicker. So there's a lot of tools in the tool belt internationally, but the JET-P is a very important one.
So you think that's going to be that's a model that we have now that could be repeated for other
I think so. I think it's a really nice, really powerful tool. We've got to execute. The South Africans have to execute on their end. The U.S. and other key partner countries need to execute on our end in terms of stepping up, and and Congress, of course, will need to do its part to try to bring some funding and some additional tools and flexibility of the DFC model and other models so we can all do our parts. But I think it is an incredibly important tool.
So this, at Axios, we'd probably call a Mike Allen question, which is, what is the most unexpectedly exciting part of your job as Deputy Secretary of Energy?
It's a really, really cool job, I have to say. Like, I feel really lucky with it. I think the coolest part of it, and I've had a chance to visit a lot of our national labs and look at like really cool stuff. Like a lot of our DOE labs are used as backdrops for sci-fi movies and other things because we have particle accelerators. I was recently at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which has 192 lasers all pointing into an infinitesimally small spot that has achieved some really real fusion progress on that piece, which is super cool. But the part that's most exciting to me is getting out and talking to our researchers, including a lot of young people who are coming into this line of work. We have something called the Clean Energy Corps, where we're actually hiring 700 people to help us execute on the $100 billion Congress has given us to do all these public-private partnerships. And it's just incredibly inspiring that people are making career choices, making decisions about what they want to do with their lives to be part of this transition. And in the end, it's going to be people, researchers, government workers, entrepreneurs, leaders of big companies, all making decisions to execute that's going to actually make this happen. So that's the coolest part, is working part of that team with Secretary Granholm, who's just a phenomenal, phenomenal leader for those who've had a chance to work with her. And it's really exciting. I think this is it. I think we're making progress. This is the moment where I think history is going to look back on, if we execute and we work in partnership, that this is the turning point.
Awesome. Well,
Yep.
Thank you. I want to thank those in our audience, as well as those watching online, for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to our energy and climate newsletter, Axios Generate. And of course, listen to our podcast, Axios Today, where we bring you everything you need to know to start your day informed. And we hope these conversations made you smarter, faster. So thank you, and have a great day. And thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
I love the sock.